Tales of the undead with penchant for sucking life from the living were told long before Bram Stoker imagined his undead aristocrat. The specifics of the legend vary in different parts of the world, but the core tale involving blood-drinking revenants comes up again and again. Dracula was not the first vampire book written by an Irish writer, although it is certainly the most famous. J. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla preceded the publication of Dracula by a quarter of a century. But both novels drew on Slavic folklore and stories from the 18th century primarily. The folk tales tended to involve a recently deceased family member who, upon exhumation, did not seem to have decomposed at all and instead appeared to be full of fresh blood. Eventually, light sensitivity and an aversion to garlic were added to the classic vampire folklore. Dracula's ability to shapeshift, especially into the form of a bat, was Stoker's idea. I must move myself out of the way here, into the middle of the blood. Many aspects of the story seem to have been inspired by Stoker's personal history. As a small child suffering from unidentified illness, he was frequently bled by his uncle, who was a medical doctor. Other aspects of the story related to beliefs about disease and treatment that were prevalent in the mid-19th century when Stoker was growing up. These superstitions often accompanied the spread of diseases such as cholera, smallpox, typhus, and typhoid that apparently originated in Eastern Europe, an area that was in the late 19th century and even into the early 20th century associated with poisonous or noxious air and the dissemination of evil humours. The arrival of vampire myths in Western Europe coincided with epidemics of disease all across the continent, particularly throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. It is difficult to pinpoint exactly the location for the birth of the European vampire. It's fairly generally accepted that the legends originated in Eastern Europe. But so many changes of boundaries and rules have occurred and rulers have occurred over the last 300 years. Sorry, I'm just going to move myself out of the way again. That it's really impossible to specify a particular country. Hungary and Romania are most frequently indicated, and there's a strong vampiric tradition in Serbian culture and in rural parts of Poland. The folklore was present in Germany from at least the 17th century. But vampire stories were also common in Greek, Chinese, and Japanese folklore. So it's not a particularly or peculiarly Eastern European phenomenon. It also turns up in South America. It is generally accepted that the word for vampire has a Slavic origin, but it is definitely the case that most of the references to such characters as Vlad the Impaler as a role model for Dracula was originated really in Western literature. Whether that was racist or not, we can only speculate. In the early 19th century, ahead of both Sheridan and Stoker, sorry, I think I'm going to disappear myself because I'm blocking the slides. Both, as I said, ahead of both Sheridan and Stoker, Dr. John Polidori wrote a book entitled The Vampire, in which he described the danger from the East. He associated Arab connections with the spreading of the vampire myth across Hungary, Poland, Austria, and Serbia, where he said vampires nightly imbibed a certain portion of the blood of their victims, who became emaciated, lost their strength, and speedily died of consumptions. Whilst these human bloodsuckers fattened and their veins became distended to such a state of repletion as to cause the blood to flow from all of the passages of their bodies and even from the very pores of their skins. Some 6 years later, the novel Varney the Vampire was published. Now, this might sound like a joke title, but the book was published as a serious novel. It told the story of Sir John Varney from his own point of view, by presenting the story as his journal. The diary was supposedly left behind with the priest, only to be released after Varney's death by suicide, when he jumped into Mount Vesuvius and cured his vampirism by burning himself to death. Yes. The first documented references to vampires emerging from Eastern Europe into Western consciousness were in the 17th century. There were stories about vampires in Poland and Russia in the French journal Mercure Galant in 1691 and 1694. Now, this seems particularly strange because the Mercure Galant was a fashion journal and wouldn't have seemed like the obvious source of information about vampires. The indications for a vampire, as outlined in the magazine, are similar to other sources. The reference to the vampire's hunger and eating the cloth around him gave rise to another name. This was Shroud Eater. The description in Mercure Galant said they appear from midday to midnight and come to suck the blood of living people and animals in such great abundance that sometimes it comes out of their mouths, their noses, and especially their ears, and that sometimes the body swims in its blood, which is spilled out of its coffin. They say the vampire has a kind of hunger that causes him to eat the cloth he finds around him. This revenant, or vampire, or a demon in his form, comes out of his tomb and goes about at night violently embracing and seizing his friends and relatives and sucking their blood until they are weakened and exhausted, and finally causes their death. This persecution does not stop at one person, but extends to the last person of the family. Excuse me, at least as long as one does not interrupt its course by cutting off the head or opening the body of the vampire. In 1693, the Sorbonne University in Paris was asked by a Polish cleric for advice on how to deal with vampires or corpses believed to be vampires. The university authorities took the request seriously and did their best to find information on the subject. In the same year, Pope Benedict XIV received a similar request in Rome, and he also had it followed up. In Germany, the 18th century saw the publication of academic works about vampires. In 1721, Gabriel Radzinski, who was a Jesuit, published Historia Naturalis Curiosi Regni Polonia, roughly the strange natural history of the Kingdom of Poland, which records accounts of vampires in that country. It was published by the Society of Jesus, and it suggests that not only was the author had religious connections, but that he probably was a Jesuit priest. There was general coverage of vampirism among German-speaking people that were reported in several Viennese newspapers in 1725. On several occasions, particularly on the periphery of the Habsburg Empire during the 17th and 18th centuries, dead people were suspected of being revenants or vampires and consequently were dug up and destroyed. Some contemporary authors name this phenomenon magia posthuma, in other words, post-death destruction. You can see here, that in Krakow, in Poland, a corpse was pulled from a grave for being suspected of being a vampire in 1624, and inside the grave her corpse was found as red as blood, her shroud was in her mouth, and when the head was touched, blood was still flowing. At Graditz in Germany, two of the emperor's troops were said to have witnessed a vampire. This was a 62-year-old man named Peter Plagojewicz, who was said to have died and come back to his son after death, looking for food. This incident was followed by the illness and death of a number of villagers. Officials were sent to investigate, and they included an executioner in their number. They opened a number of graves of people who had been dead for some weeks and found them in the expected condition. But when they opened the grave of Plavogovich, they found him with his eyes open, looking healthy but motionless. The executioner drove a stake through his heart to make certain that he was dead. In Serbia in 1726, a man called Arnold Paoli died. He was believed to have become a vampire and to have started an epidemic of vampirism in his hometown that left 16 people dead. People in the area remembered that while alive, Paoli had said that during his military service in the Turkish army in southern Siberia, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire, he was harassed and eventually attacked by a vampire. To rid themselves of Paoli, the villagers opened his grave 40 days after his burial and found his body in a fresh condition, uncorrupted. I don't know if this is, it's not a picture of Paoli necessarily, but, and the teeth look like a more modern interpretation of the vampire. But fresh blood was flowing from Paoli's mouth, nose, ears and eyes, and the corpse's shirt and cloth and the whole coffin were all covered with blood. Consequently, the villagers drove a stake through his heart, which made his corpse groan loudly and bleed profusely. His corpse was then burned and the ashes were returned to the grave. These and similar incidents were often witnessed by civil authorities, clerics, soldiers, and others who might be expected not to let their imaginations run away with them too much. Suspected vampires were examined by prominent citizens and doctors usually, and documented by official reports. A corpse was deemed to be a vampire if it was insufficiently decomposed, looked robust, or most importantly, if it was full of blood pouring from the mouth and nose. You can see here in the nasty picture on the right a corpse that was discovered with this very large stone forced into its mouth, which was another way of preventing it from eating in its deadly condition. The 17th century French monk Antoine Augustin Colomet described reports of the interred dead noisily feeding on their own flesh. There was nothing else to eat in the grave, obviously. The vampire often appeared as a normal person, sometimes appearing long after death. Victims were left exsanguinated and pale. The fear of vampires was so severe that extreme measures were taken. There were different ways to find vampires. In parts of Russia and Hungary, a young pure boy, presumably a virgin, had to ride a jet black horse over a graveyard until the horse balked, indicating that it was a vampire's grave. Once discovered, the vampire had to be destroyed. Sometimes suspected vampire graves were bolted or weighted shut, or in this case where you can see chains all across it. In more extreme cases, a corpse was exhumed and burned, or decapitated and then burned, or stabbed and then decapitated, etc., etc. Another recommendation was to chop up a vampire and boil it in wine. Not quite sure what the rationale was there, but we probably aren't really talking about rationality. In Serbia, the non-squeamish could eat dirt from the grave and rub themselves with the blood of the corpse to provide anti-vampire protection. Many vampire scares in Europe took place against a backdrop of instability or disease, raising the general level of fear and tension. Most suspected vampires had untimely deaths and had been buried roughly, making it more likely that a corpse would draw attention. Rapidly dug shallow graves, such as during a disease outbreak, were also most likely to show signs of disturbance. Basically, when the contents of a grave did not meet preconceived expectations, vampirism became the explanation. Modern scholars have looked to medical explanations of the universality of the vampire myth, and in some cases suggested that We know what vampirism, in fact, based on the symptoms of known diseases. Pellagra, a deficiency of niacin and tryptophan that causes sun-sensitive skin, a red tongue, and erratic behaviour, has been suggested as one culprit. Another suggestion is that vampire and werewolf myths derived from a disease known as porphyria. The symptoms of congenital porphyria in particular were cited. This was light-sensitive skin, a lack of heme molecule in hemoglobin, could have driven sufferers to bite others and drink blood, and explains the sensitivity to garlic. The effect it had on the teeth of the sufferer, this is just a very mild case you can see here, could easily have contributed to the vampire myth. World history and Irish history is replete with epidemics. And of course, as we know, they're not confined to the past. The Black Death, the plague, came into Ireland in the 14th century, arriving to Ireland by sea. It continued to have outbreaks until the 18th century, although it had mainly declined by the 17th century. It is said to have decimated Cromwell's troops when they were in Ireland. The plague in its decline was quickly replaced by typhus, which also came from the east via England. The disease continued to sweep across Europe right through the 18th century and was accompanied by cholera epidemics. The Irish writer John Banham described cholera as the monster from the east in his lengthy poem, The Chaunt of the Cholera, as the worst ever wave of cholera swept from Europe towards Ireland. The early 19th century was a period when the medical profession was still baffled by the origin and spread of fever, and an era when physicians in Dublin were as likely to suffer fever infection as their patients. In 1835, Bram Stoker's uncle William, who was chief medical officer in Cork Street Fever Hospital, wrote a review of epidemic diseases in Dublin, including the catastrophic cholera epidemic of 1832. He blamed wind from the east and northeast for that outbreak. This is John Banham, who basically described it as vampire as the monster, but disease as a monster as well. And what you see here is a contemporary description of monster soup, which was a description of the filthy water that came from the Thames that poor people and even less poor were forced to drink. So the images of Dracula inserting himself into victims' homes as a noxious vapor are consistent through many films of the story. The images reflect the miasma theory of disease transmission, which was still dominant for most of the 19th century. Miasma was also known as night air, which is significant in terms of vampires' supposed confinement to the night. The theory held that the origin of epidemics was a miasma that emanated from rotting organic matter. The theory was typically associated with the spread of disease, but some academics in the early 19th century suggested that the miasma could extend to other conditions as well. For example, one could become obese by inhaling the odour of food. There were several epidemics of cholera in Ireland during the 19th century, but the most virulent was the one that occurred in 1832. The medical bodies of Ireland had long warned of the approach of cholera, a highly contagious disease which spread from India to Russia in 1817, reached Germany in 1830 and England late in 1831. It was a mysterious contagion coming from afar and therefore consistent with stories of vampirism around the world, not just Europe. It was especially so because of the absence of a scientific explanation for epidemics was frequently ascribed to supernatural causes. In the case of the arrival of cholera in Ireland, the threatened calamity, warned about in more than 20 newspapers, first appeared in Belfast and Dublin during March 1832, and by April of that year it had spread to Cork and the south of the country. It reached almost every corner of Ireland. In Dublin alone, 11,000 people were affected, with a death rate of over 5,000. Cholera caused an otherwise healthy person to fall ill with extreme stomach cramping, followed by severe diarrhea and vomiting. The patient, still alert until the end, would become so dehydrated that their blood would become as thick as glue, and the face and limbs sunken and blue. Doctors would treat cholera patients by bleeding them, giving turpentine enemies and brandy, and occasionally pouring boiling water on the patient's stomach. Bram Stoker's mother, Charlotte, lived through the Sligo cholera epidemic of 1832. She wrote an account describing the disease, which killed around 1,500 people in what was then a very small town in less than 2 months. She explained how people in Sligo believed cholera came from the sea and travelled overland like a mist, just like her son would later write of Count Dracula. Charlotte also wrote about people being accidentally buried alive in mass graves, along with other chilling events. She noted that the local Catholic clergy seemed immune to the disease while continuing to tend to victims, with one priest armed with a horsewhip guarding cholera patients from murderous staff at the local infirmary. Sadly, during that first virulent epidemic, there were many cases of people being prepared to resort to violence to protect themselves from the sick, or even those who were considered to pose a threat because they had been in contact with patients. While it did not translate into a vampire myth here in the same way as it did in other parts of the world, the fear engendered by epidemics of cholera, typhus, typhoid, and other virulently contagious diseases was mainly due to ignorance about the cause of the diseases. The real cause of cholera was only identified as late as 1883 as a microorganism, the Vibrio cholerae, which grows in the alimentary canal. The organism thrived whenever sanitation was poor and social contact intense, and the incidences of the disease became fewer and further between as public sanitation improved. Stoker's Dracula was first published in 1897, by which time there was sufficient imaginative distance from the horrific epidemics of earlier in the century that it could be said to be safe to enjoy the thrill of reading about the vampire threat coming from the East. The dreadful influenza pandemic was 20 years in the future, and in any case, the symptoms did not lend themselves to association with the threat of vampires. When F.W. Murnau released his film Nosferatu in 1922, he made some significant changes to Stoker's plot, not least in the addition of disease-carrying rats that accompany the vampire when he sails into port. Max Schreck's portrayal of the vampire is a chilling representation of the image identified in the so-called expert studies from previous centuries. Stoker's widow Florence sued the studio successfully for breach of copyright and tried to have the film destroyed. Thankfully, some copies were preserved, and we can still see this marvelous example of German expressionism in all its glory. The 1851 census of Ireland describes factors such as location, living conditions, occupations, life expectancy, and seasonal instances of death due to disease in mid-19th century Ireland. Child mortality was high, and many people died in young adulthood, with fewer living to advanced old age. This is an early 20th century photograph of one of the tenements in Dublin, but it gives a good indication of the poverty that was prevalent. All social classes were vulnerable to outbreaks of whooping cough, cholera, typhus, dysentery, influenza, smallpox, measles, and many other illnesses which were later prevented by vaccination. In Dublin and large towns, the contents of chamber pots were thrown onto the streets, and drinking water and food were usually contaminated. There were few doctors, and there were no treatments for a wide variety of ailments and conditions, while the best medical care was almost exclusively for those who could pay for it. Disease was also rife in institutions such as prisons, workhouses, hospitals, and the city slums, where people lived in unhygienic conditions and in very close proximity to each other. So all of these conditions existed in the Dublin, in which Bram Stoker was born and spent his formative years. It's hardly surprising that so many of the horrors he experienced directly or heard about from his family or witnessed as a child living in a vulnerable area of Dublin found their way into perhaps the best known Gothic novel in the world. Thank you.